On November 10, 2025, the Holy See announced a Vatican appointment small enough to disappear between a dozen other names. Pope Leo XIV had named a Nigerian Augustinian priest, Father Edward Daniang Daleng, vice-regent of the prefecture of the Papal Household. The title itself was strange. The Vatican constitution that governs the office lays out two leadership positions, a prefect at the top, assisted by a regent. It says nothing about a vice-regent, and when Leo made the appointment, the prefect's chair had already been vacant for years. He could have filled it with a bishop or an experienced Vatican diplomat and left the structure exactly as it was written. He chose Daleng first. 4 months later, on March 30, 2026, Leo finally appointed Archbishop Petar Rejic as prefect. The vacancy ended. Daleng stayed exactly where the Pope had placed him, inside a role that still wasn't mentioned in the Constitution, but now appeared openly in the Vatican's own directory. That changes the question. Daleng wasn't brought in simply because the office needed someone while the top chair stood empty. Leo wanted this Nigerian priest inside the structure even after its new head arrived. So why did Pope Leo add another position to one of the offices closest to his daily life? And out of every priest, bishop, and Vatican veteran he could have chosen, why this man? To answer that, you first have to understand what the prefecture of the Papal Household actually does, because its name makes it sound far more ceremonial than it is. Before a president ever walks into a room with the Pope, somebody in this office has already decided where that president waits, who receives him at the door, who enters first, how long the private conversation can last, where everyone stands for the photograph, and what happens the second the meeting ends. The prefecture organizes the Pope's public, special, and private audiences. It handles the order of precedence when cardinals, ambassadors, government ministers, and members of royal families all arrive at the same time. It prepares the non-liturgical side of papal ceremonies, arranges the spiritual exercises of the Pope and the Roman Curia, and handles the practical preparations whenever the Pope moves through Vatican City, Rome, or somewhere else in Italy. The Pope is the only person the cameras are watching. An entire office has already arranged the world around him before he enters the frame. For years, that office had operated without a prefect. Its previous head was Archbishop George Genswein, the tall, striking private secretary of Benedict XVI, who became so recognizable that Italian magazines sometimes treated him like a celebrity. After his departure, Monsignor Leonardo Sapienza, the longtime regent, kept the daily work moving without anyone sitting above him. Then Leo arrived. His first major change wasn't to replace Sapienza or immediately fill the vacancy left by Genswein. He placed Daleng beside the regent and gave him a title the office had not previously listed. The man almost nobody outside Rome had heard of entered an office that decides who gets close to one of the most visible people on earth. And the path that brought him there began almost 25 years earlier, in Nigeria, when both men were starting something new. Edward Daniang Daleng was born on the 4th of April, 1977, in Yitlar, in Kwara, Plateau State, in Nigeria's Middle Belt. He entered the Order of St. Augustine and made his first religious profession on November 9, 2001. Now hold that date next to another one. Just 2 months earlier, on September 14th, Robert Prevost had turned 46 years old. On that same birthday, his fellow Augustinians elected him Prior General, placing him in charge of the order worldwide. By November, less than 2 months into the job, Prevost was already in Nigeria. That was where the two men first met, a young Nigerian friar making his first vows, and the newly elected leader of the Augustinian order visiting one of its communities far from Rome. Neither of them had any reason to believe the meeting would matter outside the life of the order. Prevost was a priest taking on a demanding international assignment. Daleng had only just begun the religious life that would shape everything that followed. Daleng moved to Rome in 2002, and the paths kept crossing. Over the next 2 decades, he and Prevost had many opportunities to meet and talk, a relationship Daleng himself later described in interviews. That detail matters. Daleng's link to Prevost did not consist of an occasional handshake during an official visit. It grew through repeated contact in Rome and through their shared Augustinian order long before either man knew a papacy was waiting at the end of the road. When Daleng was asked what had stayed with him across all those years, he gave a simple answer: Prevost's humility. his ability to listen. The responsibilities changed as he moved through the church, but Daleng recognized the same man underneath them. Nigeria also remained part of Prevost's life. As Prior General, he returned again and again. Daleng says Prevost visited every Augustinian mission in Africa and came to Nigeria on at least 10 occasions. He attended their chapters, followed the development of their communities, and kept showing up when the situation was difficult. The Augustinians had built a wide network of schools and formation centers in Nigeria, but the government eventually seized their educational institutions. For years, the order struggled to rebuild. In 2006, Daleng says Prevost's support helped make a new college possible for the boys and girls who had lost those classrooms. A decade later, in 2016, Prevost returned for the first intermediate general chapter the Augustinians had ever held on Nigerian soil. His connection with Africa continued after he left the leadership of the order. Near the end of 2024, while serving in Rome as a cardinal, he was back in Kenya, where the Augustinians operate religious communities and centers serving people with AIDS. So when Daleng spoke about the newly elected Pope in May of 2025, he didn't sound like a man repeating a line prepared for the press. He has Africa in his heart, he said. Daleng had watched that relationship develop from the inside. Prevost kept returning to the same communities when there was no global audience waiting and no papal image to manage. Africa had been part of his work for decades. That history explains why Daleng's appointment carried such meaning for African Catholics. A Nigerian priest was moving into an office at the center of the Vatican, close to the daily life of a pope who already knew the continent through years of direct contact. But geography alone doesn't explain why Daleng was qualified to stand there. While the relationship between the two men was growing, Daleng was building a record of his own. He made his solemn vows in 2004 and was ordained a priest on September 10, 2005. He later studied moral theology at the Pontifical Alphonsian Academy in Rome and completed his doctorate in 2012. The subject he chose is revealing. Daleng wrote about the dignity and care owed to patients suffering from incurable and terminal illnesses. In plain terms, he spent years thinking about how a human being should be treated when medicine can no longer offer a cure, and the person has become entirely dependent upon the care of others. That kind of work doesn't prepare someone to manage a papal audience in any obvious way. It does tell you something about the questions that held his attention: responsibility, dignity, and what one person owes another when power is unevenly distributed between them. Inside the Augustinian order, Daleng gradually moved into positions that demanded more administration and far more knowledge of Rome. He became a general counselor with responsibility connected to the order's work in Africa. Later, he served as Procurator General, the man responsible for handling the Augustinians' official business with the Holy See. That meant dealing directly with Vatican offices, following cases through the Roman system, and learning how decisions move through an institution where almost nothing happens through a single door. By the time Leo became Pope, Daleng understood the Augustinian world, the African Church, and the machinery of the Holy See. He also knew Robert Prevost as a person, from decades before the white cassock changed the way every new face approached him. Friendship might explain the trust. It doesn't explain the competence. Daleng built that part himself, and that combination is where the appointment begins to make sense. In November of 2025, the prefecture of the Papal Household still had no prefect. Sapienza remained the regent and continued to run its daily work. Leo added Daleng beside him as vice-regent, introducing another senior figure into an office whose constitution only described the two established leadership roles. Then, 4 months later, Archbishop Petar Rajic arrived. Rajic was an experienced Vatican diplomat who had served as the Pope's representative in several countries and, most recently, as Apostolic Nuncio to Italy. Leo placed him at the top of the prefecture, finally restoring an active prefect to an office that had gone more than 6 years without one. Nothing happened to Daleng's role. The Vatican's current directory now lists all 3 men: Rajic as prefect, Sapienza as regent, Daleng as vice-regent. The office no longer has a missing leader, yet the new position remains. That one fact tells you more than the original appointment notice ever did. Leo was not using Daleng as a temporary answer to an empty chair. He had decided that this particular priest belonged inside the leadership of the household, working alongside the men who already understood its protocol and daily rhythm. There is no public decree where the Pope explains the decision line by line. He has never said exactly why he added the position, or why he selected Daleng over someone else. But look at what Leo already knew about him. He had seen Daleng as a young friar in Nigeria, and followed his formation in Rome. He knew the kind of work Daleng had done inside the Augustinian order, and he knew how he handled responsibility when there was no public attention attached to it. By 2025, their relationship had survived changes that transformed both of their lives. A pope can study a resume. He can ask for references. What he rarely has is 25 years of direct knowledge about how someone behaves before power makes the relationship useful. Daleng had been there while Prevost was Prior General, long before he became a bishop in Peru, a cardinal in Rome, and eventually Pope Leo XIV. That kind of history becomes more valuable after an election, because the papacy changes every relationship around the man who holds it. People begin measuring their words. Old acquaintances suddenly want access. Every favor can be misread, and every new friendship arrives carrying the possibility that someone wants something from the Pope rather than from the person underneath the office. Daleng came from before all of that. His work now places him where the private household meets the outside world. He helps with the structure surrounding audiences, ceremonies, protocol, and the visitors who enter the Pope's day. A president or a king may be the person standing beside Leo in the photograph, but Daleng belongs to the office that made the meeting possible. His role is different from that of Leo's private secretaries. Monsignor Edgard Rimikuna manages the Pope's correspondence, meetings, and official workload. Rimikuna first met Prevost in 2006, when he was a seminarian and Prevost was leading the Augustinian order. Years later, after Prevost became Bishop of Chiclayo, the two worked closely in Peru. Father Marco Billier serves as Leo's second secretary, helping carry the flood of documents and requests that reaches the Pope every day. Anton Kapler, the former Swiss guard, handles the practical physical details around Leo during public appearances and inside the household. Daleng stands at another point in the same system. His office organizes the people moving toward the Pope and the formal world through which they reach him. That places a Nigerian Augustinian inside one of the narrowest channels of access in the Catholic Church. The symbolism is real. African Catholics can look at Daleng and see someone formed in their church standing near the center of Rome. But his story becomes much smaller if it is reduced to representation. Leo knew the country he came from. He had watched Daleng grow inside their shared religious order and had already trusted him with work in Rome. Daleng then spent years learning the Holy See from the inside, long before the Pope had any position available to give him. The appointment brought those two histories together. There is another part of the story that is easy to miss. When Leo named Daleng vice-regent in November, some people assumed the appointment might be an improvised response to the vacancy above him. Perhaps Daleng would help Sapienza carry the office until a prefect was chosen. Perhaps the title would disappear once the structure returned to normal. March answered that question. Leo appointed a prefect and kept Daleng. The role had survived the problem that supposedly explained why it existed. That leaves us with a more personal explanation. Pope Leo wanted a man he had known since 2001 inside the household that controls access to his daily life. Daleng's qualifications made the choice defensible on paper. The years between them made it possible in practice. Think back to their first meeting. Robert Prevost had just become Prior General. Edward Daleng had just made his first vows. One was beginning to carry an international religious order. The other was still learning what his own vocation would require. Prevost kept returning to Nigeria. Daleng moved to Rome, became a priest, studied moral theology, and eventually handled the Augustinians' relationship with the Holy See. The distance between their work kept shrinking until one of them became pope and the other entered the office responsible for organizing the world immediately around him. The Holy See announced all of that with a name and a title, then moved on to the next appointment. No explanation. No ceremony built around the relationship, just Father Edward Daniang Daleng, vice-regent of the prefecture of the Papal Household, and 4 months later, when the chair above him finally received a name, he was still there. If stories like this are why you're here, subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments what surprised you most about the relationship between Pope Leo and Father Daleng. The top chair has a name now. The place Leo made beside it still belongs to the Nigerian friar he first met 25 years ago. God bless.